together to honor him, that he was put into the canon of film geniuses effectively. It didn't happen until long after he was
Well,
done.
keep on reading.
Okay.
Keep on reading, because there is a period. It's not quite that bleak. I mean, it certainly, I think, is true that as a member of the Pantheon, that didn't start to happen until the last couple years of his life, as his films were restored and things like that.
Yeah.
And in fact, after his death, even more so, to the point that now often, in these kind of crowdsourced from critics lists of what are the greatest comedies of all time, he'll make it on and Chaplin won't even make it on.
Right.
Like their reputations now are sort of neck and neck in a way. But that did come later. But in the 1950s, in fact, he had a career resurgence that's really heartening to read about and really fun to explore online as well with television. With television, which was live at the beginning. I mean, early television, he really got in on. Really early television.
Yeah, I think I remember that from the Bogdanovich, but I'll read more in detail in your book.
But so this is why I want people to not take away that, even though he did have this really, really dark time of alcoholism and depression in the 1930s, which I want to talk about with you as well, it's not at all the case that it's simply, a crash and burn narrative and he was a child star and, film.
No, I didn't
and then, so he really kind of clawed his way back and started to do interesting experimental things. He was not in charge of the game to the extent he had been.
He was in a Beckett short film, right?
Yeah. One of the last things that he did in the last couple years of his life in 1965, I believe it came out. He taped it in 64, but he is in the only movie that Samuel Beckett ever wrote, which is called Film, just Film.
And if that isn't a tip of the hat of the sort of lofty modernness, kind of like, cryptic, nod, I don't know what is.
Yeah,
right?
And if you think about it, of course they go together.
Sure.
Beckett and Keaton, and Beckett in fact grew up loving him and watching him and Chaplin.
Well, he is Godot, right?
In that he never arrives.
No, but just in that, like that play is sensibility-wise would be good for Keaton.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, he was offered the part, and I write about that as well. He was offered the part of Lucky, who is the character who's sort of like an enslaved person. And in Waiting for Godot, there's a guy Pozzo who brings on this other guy with a rope around his neck.
Yeah.
And that character, Lucky, with the rope around his neck, is totally silent except for a couple of like gibberish speeches. These kind of long speeches that are kind of parodies of like academic gibberish. It's a really strange role. The whole play is, but I mean, that role in particular takes a very particular talent to play, right? Wallace Shawn actually played that character in an online production of Godot that I saw since the pandemic. But that was the part Keaton was offered, and he didn't take it in the first American production. So it started in France, and this was going to be the first American production that had Burt Lahr in it. He was one of the two main guys, and Keaton was offered the part of Lucky. He never read the script. His wife, Eleanor, his last wife, usually read scripts for him and sort of told him about them, and then he would decide. And she read it and said, "I have no idea what the hell this is about," and so they turned it down. But that's another kind of moment where it's a sliding doors thing, right? What would have happened if he had appeared in the first Waiting for Godot? Where you really can incorporate physical comedy and the stuff that he was so good at.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that Time sort of like at least gave him the honor and respect that he deserved, and that it did turn around, and he seemed to end. It seemed like that last marriage to Eleanor was great.
Yeah, it's the fact that he found happiness for really the last third of his life. Yeah. It helps to redeem how painful it is to read about that period where he did sort of lose everything and lose himself.
And I love that, like the speculation that in that bit where the building falls on him, that last movie, it wasn't the cameraman,
that was Steamboat Bill Jr., his last independent.
That he was so depressed and possibly suicidal that he actually didn't give a shit,
right?
Whether he lived or died in that stunt.
Well, the background to that stunt is really, I mean, it almost seems like it has to be a compressed timeline for a biopic or something. But I think this is true. Is that the day before, or a couple days before he was going to film that stunt, so it had already been completely rigged out and everything for this 2-ton house front to fall over him. He hears from Joe Skank, his producer and brother-in-law, who he's been making movies for, patronized by financially for a decade almost. He hears that his independent studio is being taken away, like it's just happening. He's suddenly told, "This is your last movie that you make the way you want to make it. I'm now handing you over to my brother Nick Skank, who runs MGM, and you're going to become an MGM contract player."
Skank, what a name!
Right.
Also, like just to tell people who are listening, because obviously we can't go through the whole book, the way you sort of string through it, how women are treated and how they're represented, and the struggle of actresses throughout this thing is good. I think that the idea that there was in the 20s or the teens, there was a lot of women directors around doing this, and then as the business became more lucrative and more manageable, it just kind of became the domain of men, and they were pushed out. Yeah,
I mean, that was something I learned in the process of writing and researching this that I didn't know at all, which is that there was this period in the teens, like you say, where there were more women working in the industry in high positions than there are now. I think it was 1917. I remember reading this statistic, and maybe in the last couple years it's been surpassed, but up until a couple years ago, there were more women working in high positions, like directors, cinematographers, having their own production company, than there have been in any year since, including now. Like 1917 was the high point.
It's wild. And also, the sort of addressing the race issue from the scenes in college. Is it college?
Yes, there's a blackface scene in college that I write a chapter.
And also like talking about, what's his name, Burt Williams?
Burt Williams,
and the history of him and vaudeville, and Buster's connection to vaudeville, and just the way race was handled at that time, on screen, off screen. And there was obviously an insensitivity, but was it malicious? It's hard to know, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, really hard to encounter any culture of that period without finding blackface somewhere. And even further into the 20th century, right? Judy Garland did blackface, and Fred Astaire did blackface, and I mean, it was really, really a standard, obviously in vaudeville, but even in film for the first half of the century was a very common trope.
It's really because it was standard, and because there was this lack of cultural empathy, that I don't think these people really thought of it as anything insulting.
Yeah, I mean, I think, even watching Mad Men, you kind of see that, right? I mean, it's really taken until the last 25 years or so, Spike Lee's movie about blackface, for us to start to look at
it. I watched that again, specifically to sort of feel the weight of what minstrelsy really looked like.
Bamboozled. Yeah, it's one of my favorite Spike Lee movies.
It really is, because, he went out of his way to heighten the production values of that minstrel show to such a degree to where the grotesqueness of it becomes more apparent because of how meticulous he played it. How not only historically accurate, but so heightened. It was mind-blowing to me. Remains mind-blowing to me.
Yeah, I rewatched that actually when I was writing the chapter about Burt Williams. volumes because I was just reading and watching everything I could get my hands on about blackface, and that movie really impressed me, like more than it did when it came out. It was really aged incredibly well.
Yeah, I don't love the I think it gets a little hokey. I think that Damon did something with that character that was annoying, but just for the footage of the show alone.
Yeah, that's what I mean. The film within a film or whatever. The show
that was
within
the
a
whole
film.
thing.
One thing I wanted to talk about that we haven't talked about was drinking. I mean, we haven't really talked about his alcoholism in that period, which is something that I feel like has been either undercovered or overcovered in discussion of Keaton, right? There's either kind of wallowing in the dark years and sort of pretending that he never got out of it, and then, as other biographers have done, just glossed over it entirely. And understandably, his widow Eleanor did not like for that period of his life to be dwelt on. It was relatively short in terms of duration. It was just a few years of his life, but
where he was like
down and out. I mean, he really was at sort of rock bottom, to use AA language, which he would never have used himself. But that period, which happened to coincide with the Great Depression, right? How ironic is that?
Sure.
He is suddenly just walloped by depression and alcoholism and just a really non-functioning marriage and a non-functioning life. And it becomes clear for the first time, as will happen when somebody is a child star and has been basically like working since age 5 to make people laugh, right?
Yeah.
He just hit this wall, and it just seems like he could really have drunk himself to death, at that moment.
But he didn't.
Right. And somehow he dried himself out, via these sort of awful drying out methods and systems that existed at the time, getting sent to sanitariums and cures and things like that. And at some point he just somehow white-knuckled it through and made it work. But as I also write about, making it work meant a very different thing in his life and at that moment than it would now. So it was, he was not some sober guy who was drinking green juice and preaching the wonders of sobriety or something like that. In fact, he fell off the wagon several more times during his life. It seems like his whole life he had this very conflicted relationship to addiction and alcohol, and it was in part because he was such a shutdown guy. Such an impassive face. He was not in touch with himself. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, but even if you are, I mean, alcoholism, if you want to, believe the disease model, is something that is not you're going to be a victim of it.
Right.
It's not a matter of self-awareness or anything else, because once you start, it's like fucking game over.
Right.
And you're going to have to reel it back in however possible or live it.
Right. I guess I just mean that we have more of a model now to understand that.
I guess, but like the success of sobriety is limited still.
Right. Do you believe in the disease model yourself? Or, I mean, I know it's a complex thing, but
I kind of do, because like the disease model it's sort of multi-tiered, right? So it's a malady of it's a physical, mental, and spiritual malady. So like the idea that it's this trifecta of things, like if you remove the spiritual thing, which is, you can, and just deal with this sort of biological nature of it and whether it's conditional or not, either whether you got it psychologically because you grew up in it or there actually is a genetic component, I have to sort of look at the propensity to be an alcoholic or an addict as a disease. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do. I mean, it's why not?
Right.
Because then it's treatable. If you don't call it a disease, then you're going to try to will it away, which never seems to work.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
it's great talking to you. I sadly have to go to a funeral now. So
I'm sorry.
It's okay. 5 seconds passed.
I know. Yeah. That's going to be a sad affair.
Yeah. I'm going to run over there. I got to go put a black suit on. Black suit for award shows and funerals. That's what they're for.